Welcome, friend. Settle in. Let the world soften around you for a while. If it's late where you are, let this story be the lantern that flickers beside your rest. And if it's early, may it carry you gently through the quiet moments before the noise returns. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can leave it in the comments just so I know where these stories are landing. And if you'd like more of them, you know the ritual. Subscribe. Leave a small mark. Let the fold keep unfolding. Let me tell you about Tolan. No knight. No noble. No storied bloodline or banner. Just a man with soil beneath his nails, and an understanding of the world that only comes from never being invited to shape it. He was a serf bound to the land. Yes, but not owned. Not exactly. Like cattle, though some lords may have tried to blur the line. Tolan's father had tilled the same earth his grandfather did before that. Their freedom was a rumor, but their lives were intricately built on a balance that most modern people would call unbearable. And yet there was room to plant, raise children, room to grumble quietly about the absurdity of paying taxes on your own sweat. A luxury. Really. He woke each day before light touched the sky, not from purpose, but habit. There was no time for existential dread. The cows needed feeding, the wheat needed turning, and Lord Dreven, whose greatest hardship was once losing a bet at dice, would need his due. But still, Tolan had something modern life rarely allows certainty. He knew his place, knew the work, knew his neighbors would help repair his roof after a storm. Not out of kindness, but because theirs might be next. He did not ask if life was fair. That question hadn't been invented yet. Once a month, the manor court gathered, a lopsided spectacle of justice, where peasants stood trial for letting their pigs wander, or for speaking too freely about the miller's suspicious grain weight. Tolan once appeared for stealing firewood, though stealing was generous. Considering the forest had once belonged to his people's ancestors before a noble's whim declared otherwise, he paid a fine, grunted, and went back to cutting wood that same evening. Quiet resistance. That was a right, too, if you knew how to disguise it as compliance. You see, the line between slave and serf wasn't so much a border as it was a fog dense enough to obscure, thin enough to see through. If you squinted, slaves in many regions could be sold, broken, discarded. But a serf like Tolan, he was part of the estate, like a particularly mouthy fence post or an ox with opinions. You couldn't sell him without selling the land, and no landowner wanted to be the one explaining to their lord why the field now came with no one to harvest it. Tolan are the rights, strange patchwork, occasionally trampled rights, but they existed, and that, in the medieval world, was a quiet revolution in itself. Tolan wasn't free. Let's not romanticize the mudcake truth. He couldn't pack his belongings 3 wooden bowls, a patched blanket, and a chicken with attachment issues, and decide he'd rather try his luck in the next village over. No. His movements were tied to the land, like ivy to stone, like a shadow to dusk. It wasn't chains in the way people now imagine captivity, but roots, old and entangled, sunk deep beneath each step. And there was a kind of heaviness in that, a gravity that held him, not just to place, but to expectation. Yet unsolved. There was something firm inside him. Not rebellion, exactly, but resistance born of familiarity. He had known every wrinkle in that earth since boyhood. His footprints overlapped themselves through seasons and years, until walking the field became a kind of prayer. He couldn't leave, but neither could he be cast off like a cracked jug or a broken tool. If Lord Dreven wanted to throw him from that soil, he'd need a reason, one that could be spoken aloud at the manorial court. And while that court bent toward wealth, like wheat before a storm, so it still bent, and that bending was enough, sometimes, to carve space for breath. They lived humbly, Tolan and Merrill, and the 3 children who had grown into their names like saplings curling toward light. The hut, barely wide enough for a turning yoke, stood against the eastern slope of a field that had grown stubborn with stones over the years. Inside, the walls leaned slightly, as if listening. The roof leaked in the spring, and the wind sang through the cracks in winter. But there was always warmth somewhere near the hearth, beneath the folded blankets. In Merrill's hands, when she rubbed the children's feet with oil made from crushed herbs and hope, they had chickens, sometimes more than they could name, though not always more than they could feed. A goat who refused every fence, a garden that pretended to forget its boundaries when the seasons were kind, and always that patch of earth behind the hut, narrow and stony, but theirs to coax into food. That alone was a form of dignity, to plant something where no one else cared to look and still watch it grow. Merrill once joked, sharpening a dull blade with the rhythm of someone who had done it far too many times, that at least they weren't slaves. Her voice was dry, but her eyes sharp grey and unreadable, like clouded glass. "Slaves can't marry," she said once, pausing to pull a thorn from her palm. "Can't argue in court, can't pass on anything but silence." Then she tossed the thorn into the fire, as if the gesture meant more than the words. "We're not free," she added, her voice Keeta, "but at least we're not invisible. And in a world where your lord could forget your name between meals, being seen was a kind of resistance all its own. It meant something to be counted, even if only as part of the machinery. A cog still mattered, if the wheel couldn't turn without it. Serfdom was not mercy, but it was structure, a scaffold, crude and uneven, but strong enough to hold the weight of a life. It meant knowing what would be taken, and, just as importantly, what might be left. They paid taxes on their labor, their bread, their breath. Once, on a dare from their eldest, Merrill had tried to laugh at the steward's pronouncement of a new oven fee for the ash. "Mind you," he had said, adjusting a feathered cap he clearly hadn't earned. Her laughter was too loud, too free, and she was nearly fined again. But even that, the absurdity of the threat, revealed the truth. They were expected to obey. Yes, but also to exist. Slaves vanished. Serfs endured. Tolan had never seen the inside of a noble's hall, but he knew its weight. He carried it on his back each time he lifted a sack of grain too large for comfort. Yet sometimes, in the stillness between tasks, when the wind brushed the wheat and the sky turned the color of worn cloth, he allowed himself a thought he never said aloud, that if the lords vanished tomorrow, it would not stop the fields from growing. Bread would still rise, the chickens would still lay, the children would still need shoes. The world, in its simplest form, belonged more to those who turned it than to those who ruled it. That thought stayed quiet, not hidden, just resting, like a seed under frost. Waiting, he heard stories sometimes, whispered low over firelight and fatigue, of men who had run, men who'd made it past the edge of the Lord's influence, reached some town just distant enough, stayed just quiet enough, and after a year and a day, became free men. That was the rule. Or the rumor. Anyway, freedom was 12 months, and a miracle away. But Tolan had never run. Not because he was afraid, though fear was always a companion. Like hunger. Manageable, but never absent. But because he had built something here. Not a monument. Not a legacy. Just a shape. A life with weight and edges. The kind of thing that wraps around your days so tightly you forget where you end and it begins. His hands had known this earth longer than they had known rest. His roof creaked in a language only he and Merrill understood, and his children's laughter brief, unpredictable, soft as the brushing of a curtain grew in the corners of his hearing like wild mint. Roots, even muddy ones, don't let go easily. They stretch between the cracks, beneath foundations. They anchor, and sometimes, when the world calls you less than man, the quiet knowledge that you cannot be sold is worth more than escape. The seasons moved over Tolan's life like tides, slow and steady, and full of their own commandments. Spring was a negotiation between hope and memory, between seed and soil. The ground admitted nothing easily. He'd press his fingers into the thawed dirt and ask for mercy in silence. Sometimes it answered. Summer arrived, not with fire, but with a weight, a kind of constant heaviness, not just of sun but of obligation. The work didn't end, only paused for swallows of water and the wiping of a brow with a sleeve already soaked. Even the flies seemed to give up around midsummer, collapsing on fence posts and cow flanks, too tired to persist. Autumn was the great reveal, the moment the land confessed what it had been hiding. Some years it gave more than expected. Others it sneered back, with wilted promise. But winter, winter, was different. It was memory's season. The cold had a way of carving space for thoughts that harvest had no patience for, beside the hearth, with tools in need of mending and stew too thin for comfort. They'd speak softly, not of yield or weather, but of things unspoken the rest of the year. Rights, lines, whether dignity was inherited or made, whether staying was cowardice or devotion, whether peace was something you earned or simply endured into being. It was in winter that Merrill stitched longest, bent low over cloth, thread between fingers already calloused. She folded silence into shape. Her hands moved, as if memory lived in the muscle. Now and then, some new decree would arrive from a man whose boots had never touched their soil, passed along by a steward whose only hardship was a blister from poor boot fit. One year, it was a toll for using the forest paths for their safety. Of course. From what? Merrill asked flatly. The trees. She got fined again. But the next week, someone, no one knew, who left a freshly skinned rabbit on the steward's doorstep. Wrapped in a cloth folded so neatly, it felt like punctuation. Beneath it, a stitched line, "Bill me later." That was the thing about serfs. They didn't revolt often, but they were fluent in inconvenience. They could salt obedience just enough to spoil the flavor of power. They didn't always speak, but when they did, they spoke with gesture, with pause, with presence. That was their strength, not absence, but deliberate stillness. And still, through all the weight, Tolan's life had a structure modern minds might envy. No job interviews, no rent hikes by whim, no algorithm judging worthiness in secret. His dues were carved into the rhythm of land. If the Lord tried to take more, the manorial court might not side with Tolan, but it would have to listen, and sometimes just being heard shifted the weight a little. There were customs older than the stones in the chapel wall, older than memory, passed from hand to hand like seed grain, worn smooth, not by law, but by use. Not every rule was written, most verant, but they lived in the muscles, in the way people bent to lift a burden together, in the way they looked toward one another before answering the steward's call. If the Lord died without an heir, a rare but not impossible thing the village could, if united, make a bid for their own freedom, not metaphor, but real coin, pooled from hidden pouches, from wedding cloths, unwoven and remade into something heavier. It had happened once, long ago, though no one living remembered the names, just the story for 5 years. They'd lived without a master, answering only to the land and one another. The freedom had vanished with the next heir, but the memory of it remained, not as hope exactly, but as precedent. And in a world where even breath required permission, precedent was a kind of shelter. If a child lost both parents, the village took them in, not from kindness, though kindness had its place, but from structure, because roofs collapse, fires forget their bounds, sickness walks without knocking. You care for the orphan because one day the orphan might be you. It was a kind of mercy disguised as mutual survival, and survival, for people like Tolan, was the closest thing they had to a shared religion. He understood the weight of this unspoken architecture, how it steadied things even when everything else tilted. Under the right moon and a steward too distracted by gambling debts to care, a serf could marry without permission, could pass a portion of land to their eldest, as if ownership could be negotiated in harvests and not just signatures. Could, with enough seasons saved in coin, buy release from bondage entirely, not freedom in the way a noble might name it, but a different kind, one shaped like breath that doesn't flinch. These were not promises, they were possibilities, narrow, crooked, winding like footpaths through tall grass. But they existed, and the simple fact of their existence gave the serf something that slaves would never hold the shadow of agency. Slaves were not allowed futures. A slave's breath belonged to someone else, measured in labor and silence. Their children were born already owned, and if they were freed, it was only because someone higher up had decided it made them feel generous. But Tolan, for all his burdens, I could imagine a tomorrow shaped not by whim, but by weather, by sweat, by decision. Small ones, quiet ones, but his. He could stand before the manor court, bareheaded and calloused, and say the grain scale was wrong. He could point to the line at the edge of the field and say, "We always planted past that stone until last year," and the court might frown, the steward might sigh, the scribe might act as if he hadn't heard, but still, it would be written down, and that mattered, because once it was written, it had weight, however slight. It became part of the memory the lords couldn't fully erase, and over time, memory became more than protest. It became defense. Sometimes it wasn't about winning, just about recording, about saying, "I was here, I noticed, I did not disappear." That thin, stubborn thread of recognition, that was what separated Tolan from the forgotten The earth might not write your name, but it remembered your shape, and that was enough. Even now, as his back ached with a deeper groan each morning, and his hands cracked open along old lines each winter, he found comfort in the shape of what he'd built. Not grand, not glorious, but lived in, layered. He could still walk the worn path past the chapel and feel where his steps had softened the dirt. The fence post that leaned ever so slightly because his hammer had struck it tired. The edge of the well where he had once caught his breath too long. Just watching water. The grain barn, where his children once hid from chores and laughter clung to the rafters like dust. His story wasn't written anywhere, but it was there, folded into the edges. His name, not carved in stone, but whispered in routine, and in a world where so many lived and vanished without notice. That quiet continuity felt like the beginning of something larger than freedom. It felt like place, and place, when it could not be taken from you, was its own kind of power. The irony, if one believed the land had humor, was that the very laws which kept them tied to the earth were the same ones that shielded them from being flung off it. A noble might burn through silver and lineage in equal measure, might gamble away the winehouse and hunt pheasants wearing boots stitched from gold. But when the coffers ran dry and panic whispered through the halls, he could not simply point to a serf and say, "You no longer serve me. Go." That kind of decision required ritual, permission, the weight of process, however flawed, a murmur through the manorial court, a hearing with stale bread on the table and ink drying too slowly. And even if the court tilted heavily toward wealth, as it often did, there were still eyes watching, other lords listening, remembering, because precedent was a creature with sharp teeth. If one man lost his laborers without challenge, another might lose his next. And no lord wanted to explain why his fields grew empty, his grain late, his barn too quiet in autumn. The peasant might be poor, voiceless in many ways, but he was necessary, and necessity, in this world, was power by another name. Tolan understood this, not through education, but through repetition, through years of planting the same row, lifting the same beam, answering to the same voice, each harvest and learning how it cracked differently when desperate. He knew how to bend when bending was survival, how to stay silent when silence protected, and more importantly, how to remain visible just long enough to be remembered. Not cherished, not respected, just remembered. That was enough, because memory, even a grudging one, meant you could not be erased easily. The steward might frown at your petition, might mock your patched tunic and missing tooth, but if he remembered you were the one who fixed the well when the summer dried it to stone, he'd think twice before sending you away. If he remembered that your wife had nursed the sick 2 winters ago, that your eldest son helped rebuild the fence before the Lord's visit, he might look at your name on the scroll and hesitate. And hesitation was power. It cracked the certainty of dominance, let air into the gears of hierarchy. Sometimes the only thing that kept you in place wasn't justice, but recollection. A name remembered at the right moment was sturdier than any sword. The young men sometimes scoffed at this. They stood at the edges of the fields, with their fingers twitching toward futures they couldn't yet describe. They spoke of cities beyond the tree line, of wages given in coin instead of permission, of women who didn't need dowries and rooms with shutters that latched. They dreamed in pieces, sketched their escapes in broad strokes, and Tolan let them. He didn't warn. Warnings often curdle into scorn. Eyus listened quiet, steady, like someone listening to the tide slap the bank. And when the time came, and one or two of them shouldered small sacks and promises and walked down the path toward the unknown, he did not stop them. He knew the story wasn't his to write for them. He also knew how most stories bent back, folding not from failure but fatigue. They returned. Not all, but some, their hands still calloused, but differently, their eyes keener. They spoke less, laughed less. They had seen what it meant to be unanchored, to be paid fairly and fed poorly, to earn freedom and find it tasteless alone. The city didn't remember their fathers' names. It didn't wait when they fell sick or stumble when they cried. And so they came back, to fences still in need of mending, to neighbors who had not said goodbye, only see you, to the fields that, though relentless, still answered when spoken to gently. At night, when the fire dimmed to its slow orange breath and the wind whispered against the shutter, like someone trying not to wake the house, Tolan would sit on the bench he'd carved long ago, poorly shaped, uneven, but still solid, and let his thumb trace the worn grooves along its edge. Meryl might be humming in the corner, to her hands busy with some cloth that never seemed to finish being folded. The children, grown now, were often elsewhere, their lives reaching outward like vines, looking for new purchase. But sometimes they came home with mud on their boots and something softer in their shoulders. And in those moments, the silence between words felt like music, the kind of music only the weary understand. The hut had changed little in 20 years. The roof sagged more. The hearthstones were cracked in new places, and a stubborn draught found its way in each winter, as if to remind them not to grow too comfortable. But the air inside still smelled of rosemary and ash, of wool and bread, and of something that didn't have a name, only a feeling, like belonging pressed into the wood grain. Tolan thought often of the difference between ownership and presence, between being used and being needed, between being bound and being claimed. He did not have much, but what he had wrapped itself around him like breath. And in that quiet, where no one was asking for anything more than the next morning's work, he sometimes allowed himself to feel something dangerously close to pride. Not loud, not the pride of flags or statues, something smaller, something that sat in the chest like a coal, not burning, but warm. He had outlived 2 stewards, 4 tax increases, and 1 rebellion that lasted exactly 37 minutes before someone realized no one had brought bread. He had watched storms take roofs, frost take crops, and grief take neighbors. He had folded his life into the seams of this village, not the center. Never that, but somewhere between the well and the grain barn, in the space where things held because someone kept holding them. Meryl, sharp-tongued and tireless, was still the general of the hearth. She managed the household like a war, fought with laughter and salt. When the steward's son tried to flirt with their daughter using a poem about wheat, Meryl sent him home with a cloth-wrapped brick and a note that read, "Here's something else from the field." The steward never mentioned it. He knew better, because the serfs, as small and bowed as they might seem from a manor window, weren't powerless. They were essential, and essential things, when cornered, do not break. They shift, they deepen, they wait, and sometimes they sharpen into something the world cannot quite name but must still respect. There was a strange dignity in that quiet structure, in the way life circled back on itself, not out of laziness, but insistence. the same fields, the same taxes, the same scowling steward with a different name and slightly newer boots, but still, the rhythms held, and those rhythms, for all their burdens, gave people like Tolan something to stand on, not proudly, not always steadily, but firmly, the kind of steadiness that didn't demand to be admired, only not taken. It wasn't freedom, not the kind sung by poets or declared on scrolls, but it was something weightier in the gut. Predictability, the kind of daily repetition that made life livable, not because it was just, but because it was knowable, in a world where whims were often more powerful than wheat. To know where you stood, even roughly, was its own kind of peace. The laws, flawed and frayed as they were, had shape, and shape was everything. You couldn't evict a serf on a whim, not without a reason that could pass through the brittle theatre of the manorial court. You couldn't demand a second tithe just because your lord had drunk too deeply at the last hunt. You couldn't claim a man's child for levy unless the court agreed he was of age. And even then, the village might whisper and stall until spring made it easier to lose someone. These weren't protections, not the way modern minds might imagine them, but they were lines, thin, shifting, often ignored, but lines all the same. And lines, even faint ones, gave people like Tolan something to lean on when everything else bent. He had learned how to press his palm gently along those lines, without appearing to test them. Are they lay here? A pause there, a question, asked at the wrong moment, in just the right tone. Presence, when wielded carefully, could pass for resistance. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the embers in the hearth hummed softly and Meryl's breathing had gone quiet, Tolan would let his mind drift, not far, but deep. He'd think of the small rituals that made their days make sense, the things they never named, but always honored, like how you didn't take more than one basket of mushrooms from the Western Grove, not because it was forbidden, but because that's where the widow gathered hers, or how you always left a strip of bark at the base of the chapel's oldest tree after taking kindling, not because the priest said to, but because your grandfather had, and his father before him, and somehow the roots had come to expect it. These weren't customs handed down through decree. They were inherited through rhythm, behaviors worn into the shape of a place. Like thumbprints in old wood, Meryl had always called it the true law, spoken in glances and gestures, kept not on paper, but in the quiet ledger of community memory. Tolan had learned it not from teaching, but from watching how the old men placed their tools down at dusk with a care that bordered on reverence, like they were returning something borrowed. How the women folded their cloths at the end of market day, even when nothing had sold, as if to say the day was still worth gathering. There was power in that folding, not as statement, but as insistence. I was here, I endured this, and enduring, in a world that often acted as if you did not exist unless bled or taxed, was no small act. Even grief had its rituals. When someone died, no one shouted their name to the heavens or carved their triumphs in stone. A folded cloth appeared on their threshold, plain, sometimes stitched with a single line of thread, sometimes blank. You didn't knock, you left it, turned, and walked away. The family would see it. They would know, and in that knowing, they would not be alone. That was what the laws didn't account for, the texture between people, the part that made a place more than tax rolls and grain counts, the part that said, even if we are not free, we are not lost. There were no names carved in the village square, no statues, no songs carried from one generation to the next that weren't bent around harvest or weather, or the memory of a flood so long ago that no one agreed which year it happened. And yet, the memory of people lingered, woven into gestures, folded into daily rhythms. Tolan remembered them, not by faces, but by moments. The man who always carried a carved spoon tucked into his belt, as though a meal might appear at any moment, and he must be ready. The woman who never walked past a gate without straightening it, no matter whose house it belonged to. The boy who once caught a dove with his bare hands and let it go, not with wonder, but with apology. These fragments lived on, not in books, but in how people sat, how they glanced toward the fields when the wind changed, how they answered a knock before it came. Tolan had long stopped trying to recall names. Names faded, but weight stayed, the weight of presence, of having once stood where someone else now stood, of having loved the same stubborn patch of land and cursed the same broken plough. That was how the village remembered, not in words, but in weight. He often wondered whether the nobles knew what that kind of memory felt like, whether, behind their walls and their glass and their papers, they understood the small power in being known by someone who owed you nothing, to be remembered not because of what you could offer, but because your laughter once pulled someone through a long winter, or because your silence, offered without explanation, made space for someone else's grief. The village kept those memories like winter stores, quiet, humble, vital, and each act, however small, pressed its thumbprint into the shape of the whole. You didn't need to be great. You just needed to be long enough, deeply enough, that someone else leaned differently because of you. That was the kind of history the scrolls never recorded. The kind that kept the beams of the houses aligned through wind, kept the soup pot full, even when coin was low, kept the eyes of the old men sharp when the steward's carriage came too fast down the path. History, written in resistance, not in rebellion, in staying, in standing, in folding the cloth one more time, even when the world was too tired to notice. Tolan once thought he might disappear when he died, that the ground would take him, and that would be that. But lately, he wasn't so sure. He began to see pieces of himself reflected back in odd places, in the way his daughter now rinsed her hands before baking, the way he always had, in the way his son rested a hand on the ox's neck before harnessing it, not for guidance, but for grounding, in the way Merrill, older now, still tied the herbs in bundles of 7, never more, never less, and hung them in the corner like she had when they were young and struggling to keep even stew from spoiling. None of them said these things aloud. They simply carried them, and perhaps that was what legacy truly meant, not to be remembered, but to continue, quietly, softly, as part of the daily breath of things, as something folded into the life of others, as a rhythm. There was a kind of silence in the village that outsiders mistook for absence. To a passing traveler, it might have seemed lifeless, the way the houses hunched into the ground, the way smoke curled low rather than high, the way voices never rose far above necessity. But that silence was not emptiness. It was full of knowing, of old jokes repeated with a glance, of griefs worn soft by time, of songs hummed only halfway, because everyone knew the rest without needing to sing it. The village didn't shout its story. It carried it like a bundle, close to the chest, tied with worn cloth and calloused hands. Tolan often thought of this silence as something alive, not a void, but a presence. It moved through the spaces between footsteps, lingered on doorways just after the last visitor had gone. It filled the breath after a long day's work, when the tools had been returned and the hearth was waiting, when no one spoke, but everyone understood the same ache in their limbs, the same hope in tomorrow's weather. It was a silence of belonging, not retreat, a silence that held you without demanding explanation. And within that silence, there were layers, places where one kind of quiet folded into another. The silence between husband and wife, for instance, long past the need to ask what the other was thinking. The silence at the edge of the fields, where the sky felt wide enough to carry your unspoken questions without ever answering them. The silence between old men as they sat with their backs against the wall of the granary. We're not speaking of the friends they'd buried, but letting the air between them settle into a shared softness. Even the animals knew it. The oxen moved slower when the frost lingered. The hens clucked in lower tones when snow was near. And the dogs, sensing moods, the way some sense storms, knew when to bark and when to simply sit beside a resting hand. Tolan had learned to trust these silences more than most words. Words could fail. They could be shaped, twisted, taken, but silence, that kind of silence, held its shape. It told the truth not through declaration, but through presence. You were there. You endured. You didn't have to say it. The air said it for you. Tolan had come to recognize the value of that kind of silence, not as an absence of speech, but as a form of memory. It was where things were kept that couldn't be said, not for lack of words, but because the words would only make them smaller. Some memories asked to be carried without translation, like the way Meryl's hand would sometimes pause mid-fold, fingers still curled around the edge of fabric. Her breath caught for a moment too long. He never asked. He didn't need to. Whatever she was seeing wasn't meant to be disturbed, only witnessed, or the way the children groaned now, with their own calluses. Their own quiets would sometimes linger a few minutes longer than needed after supper. Not out of duty, but something else, something softer, a wish. Maybe, to remain just a little longer in the space shaped by shared weariness and gentle ritual. The silence held it all. What had been lost, what had never been said, what had been given without asking anything back. In that stillness, Tolan felt most human, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had carried. He thought sometimes of the end, not with fear, but with a kind of respectful curiosity. He imagined it not as an event, but a folding, a slow, careful tucking away of the self, like Meryl did with her linens, the ones kept only for feast days, folded not because they were no longer needed, but because their use had already shaped the room. He didn't believe in heaven, not in the way the priest described it, gilded and bright and filled with answers, but he believed in the scent of cut hay and bread just pulled from the fire. He believed in the feel of dirt under fingernails, in the sound of wind worrying a door slightly ajar, and if anything waited beyond the last breath, he hoped it resembled those things: quiet, steady, familiar. He didn't need glory. He only hoped the silence would take him gently, the way the land did each seed, not as loss, but as continuation, a return to the very thing that had always carried him, a folding back into the shape of the place, into breath, into soil, into memory. There was a kind of silence in the village that outsiders mistook for absence. To a passing traveler, it might have seemed lifeless, the way the houses hunched into the ground, the way smoke curled low rather than high. the way voices never rose far above necessity. But that silence was not emptiness. It was full of knowing, of old jokes repeated with a glance, of griefs worn soft by time, of songs hummed only halfway, because everyone knew the rest without needing to sing it. The village didn't shout its story. It carried it like a bundle, close to the chest, tied with worn cloth and calloused hands. Tolan often thought of this silence as something alive, not a void, but a presence. It moved through the spaces between footsteps, lingered on doorways just after the last visitor had gone. It filled the breath after a long day's work, when the tools had been returned and the hearth was waiting, when no one spoke, but everyone understood the same ache in their limbs, the same hope in tomorrow's weather. It was a silence of belonging, not retreat, a silence that held you without demanding explanation. And within that silence, there were layers, places, where one kind of quiet folded into another. The silence between husband and wife, long past the need to ask what the other was thinking. The silence at the edge of the fields, where the sky felt wide enough to carry your unspoken questions without ever answering them. The silence between old men as they sat with their backs against the wall of the granary, not speaking of the friends they'd buried, but letting the air between them settle into a shared softness. Even the animals knew it. The oxen moved slower when the frost lingered. The hens clucked in lower tones when snow was near, and the dogs, sensing moods, the way some sense storms, knew when to bark and when to simply sit beside a resting hand. Tolan had learned to trust these silences more than most words. Words could fail. They could be shaped, twisted, taken. But silence, that kind of silence, held its shape. It told the truth, not through declaration, but through presence. You were there. You endured. You didn't have to say it. The air said it for you. And he had come to recognize the value of that kind of silence, not as an absence of speech, but as a form of memory. It was where things were kept that couldn't be said. Not for lack of words, but because the words would only make them smaller. Some memories asked to be carried without translation, like the way Meryl's hand would sometimes pause mid-fold, fingers still curled around the edge of fabric. Her breath caught for a moment, too long. He never asked. He didn't need to. Whatever she was seeing wasn't meant to be disturbed, only witnessed. Or the way the children grown now, with their own calluses, their own quiets, would sometimes linger a few minutes longer than needed after supper. Not out of duty, but something else, something softer, a wish, maybe, to remain just a little longer in the space shaped by shared weariness and gentle ritual. The silence held it all. What had been lost, what had never been said, what had been given without asking anything back. In that stillness, Tolan felt most human, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had carried. He thought sometimes of the end, not with fear, but with a kind of respectful curiosity. He imagined it not as an event, but a folding, a slow, careful tucking away of the self, like Meryl did with her linens, the ones kept only for feast days, folded not because they were no longer needed, but because their use had already shaped the room. He didn't believe in heaven, not in the way the priest described it, gilded and bright and filled with answers, but he believed in the scent of cut hay and bread just pulled from the fire. He believed in the feel of dirt under fingernails, in the sound of wind worrying a door slightly ajar, and if anything waited beyond the last breath, he hoped it resembled those things, quiet, steady, familiar. He didn't need glory. He only hoped the silence would take him gently, the way the land did each seed not as loss, but as continuation, a return to the very thing that had always carried him, a folding back into the shape of the place, into breath, into soil, into memory. Tolan turned 60 during a winter that arrived like an old creditor, quiet, familiar, unwilling to leave without taking something. Snow fell in patient layers, burying the stubble of autumn until the fields looked newly made, as though the year had pressed a fresh sheet over its tired body. The village responded, as it always did. Doors stayed shut longer. Talk grew softer, and the scent of smoke wove itself into every garment. Inside the hut, time slowed to the rhythm of the hearth's breath. Meryl spent her evenings unraveling frayed tunics to salvage thread, her fingers moving with a patience that felt older than either of them. Tolan, wrapped in a wool cloak that had outlived 2 stewards and 1 ill-fated rebellion, mended wooden handles by lamplight, small repairs that would matter come thaw. Outside, the wind rehearsed its grievances against the walls, but the hut held, as though memory itself had become mortar. Between the crackle of kindling and the distant rumble of ice shifting on the river, they spoke little. Words had grown expensive. Each one chosen carried the weight of many winters. Yet silence was never empty. It carried stories the way snow carries light quietly, relentlessly, until everything gleamed. Some nights Tolan woke before dawn, the air so cold it seemed to ring. He would sit on the edge of the cot, listening to Meryl's steady breathing, turning a folded scrap of cloth between his fingers. It bore no message, only the softness of use. He wasn't sure when he'd started carrying it to bed, perhaps after the last levy, perhaps after the last child left home, but it served as a reminder that even in sleep a man could hold on to something small and certain. One morning, after a night when the stars felt brittle enough to shatter, the steward arrived, unannounced. His boots left no prints on the packed snow. The cold had hardened the path to stone. He spoke of a supplemental tithe, a phrase so polished it nearly slid off the tongue needed. He said, to fortify distant borders none of them would ever see. Tolan listened, his breath a pale ribbon in the air, and answered only with stillness. Stillness that made the steward's voice catch, made his clerk's quill hesitate. When the visitors left, the snow seemed to close over their footprints too quickly, as if the village itself wished to swallow the encounter whole. That evening, Tolan placed a folded cloth on the hearthstone, unstitched, unmarked. Meryl added another beside it, her needle motionless for once. By morning, half the village had done the same, lining the path to the steward's quarters with silent refusal. No torches, no shouts, only folds of linen holding more weight than any spear. The tithe was postponed for review, and winter went on breathing its cold sermon, while the cloths fluttered in the draught like muted banners of survival. Spring arrived reluctantly, peeling winter back, one brittle layer at a time. Meltwater threaded through frozen furrows, whispering promises it might or might not keep. Tolan walked the perimeter of his plot, boots sinking into a mud, so eager it felt almost grateful. Each step released the faint scent of thawing earth, a smell like wet bread crust and memory. He knelt, pressed a palm to the ground, and waited for the subtle tremor that told him the soil still remembered how to give. Across the village, repairs began with the same slow devotion as prayer. Roofs were patched, fences righted, and the warped door of the chapel was rehung so gently it barely squeaked anymore. The younger men, those who had once chased the horizon, worked alongside the older, their movements tempered, their ambitions keener, but their hands surer. No one spoke of the postponed tithe. It hung in the air like a dream half, forgotten upon waking, vivid only at the edges. Yet the folded cloths remained, now tucked into eaves and tied to fence rails, bleaching white beneath a timid sun. Merrill gathered herbs where the first green showed, her knees complaining, yet obedient. She spoke to the plants the way she once soothed children, with gruff affection and unhurried certainty. At night, she returned smelling of crushed thyme and thawed grass, and Tolan felt the season shifting in her footsteps before he saw it in the fields. One evening, as dusk settled like dust, their eldest son came back from a far market with stories of towns where folded tokens had begun appearing left on magistrates' desks, slipped into merchants' ledgers, knotted around gate hinges. He spoke of them the way others spoke of omens small, persistent, reshaping the air without permission. Dola listened, feeling something stretch softly inside his chest, not pride exactly, but recognition, as though a song hummed in private had found its echo far beyond the valley. The next morning he rose early, the sky still the color of unwashed wool, and began turning the soil with deliberate strokes. The land responded like an old friend, grudging, faithful. Each clod overturned felt like a page turned in a book only he and the earth could read. By the time Merrill called him in for bread, soaked in last year's honey, the first light had caught on the ridge, and the fields looked less like history and more like possibility. He paused at the threshold, watching the breath of the ox steam in the pale gold air, and understood that survival was never just enduring it, was remembering how to begin again, even after the cold meant to teach you otherwise. And so, with thawed earth beneath his fingernails, and the soft murmurs of morning filling the gaps where silence had kept watch all winter, Tolan stepped inside, carried the warmth of the hearth into his bones, and prepared to fold this new season into the long, unbroken cloth of his life. The folded cloths did not vanish when the weather warmed. They frayed at the corners, paled under sun, caught bits of rain and dust. But they stayed. Some became part of the fences they had been tied to, woven around posts by birds, or wind, or idle hands. Others were taken down quietly and pressed into use again, rags for the table, bindings for hips, a patch for a child's knee. But all who had folded them remembered, and remembering was its own kind of rebellion. It needed no speeches, no names, only the simple act of keeping a gesture alive until it became something more than itself. Tolan saw this each day now, in smaller ways. A girl at the well wrapped her jar with cloth before carrying it, though the handle was whole. A neighbor fixed his gate with a scrap of dyed linen, not because wood was lacking, but because the color mattered. There was something being stitched into the air, invisible but unmistakable. Not a movement, not yet, but a language, a grammar of presence, a way of saying we are still here that no steward's ink could erase. The land had begun to listen again, and in its patient way, it answered with growth. That spring was generous, not lavish, but attentive. The rains came when they were needed, not more. The wheat stretched early and straight. The orchard bloomed all at once, as if making up for something it had forgotten in the years before. People began to speak more softly, not out of fear, but out of gentleness, as though the world might finally respond in kind. Merrill's herbs took root so fast, she had to dry them twice a week. Her fingers stained green, and her hair always smelling faintly of crushed leaves. She moved slower than she once had, but her movements held a quiet fluency, the kind born of decades spent in conversation with things that do not speak. When she walked through the garden, even the bees seemed to make room. Tolan noticed his own body more, in those days not with complaint, but with care. Each ache, each twinge, each breath in the cool morning air felt like a bell rung far away. He rose early, not because he had to, but because the light at that hour was a kind of grace. It made even the worn tools look new. He spent longer in the fields now, not always working sometimes, just walking the boundary stones, whispering to them as he passed, not words, just sounds, just presence, as if to say, you are still held, you are still seen, and if the land could understand, he believed it would answer. So are you. One morning, well into the season where the breeze carried warmth without warning, Tolan sat on the bench outside their home with a cup of barley broth cupped between his hands. The cup was old, cracked along one side. The glaze long faded, but it still held what it needed to. Like him, Merrill moved quietly behind him, hanging herbs to dry on the line that stretched from the corner beam to the apple tree, her fingers quick and deliberate. The light came in slanting gold through the branches, catching on the steam, rising from his cup, on the worn thread of her shawl, on the dust in the air that made everything look a little like memory. The village was waking in the way it always did, slowly, not from sleep, but from stillness. A chicken called out once, then gave up. A boy ran down the path too fast and was gently chided by someone who didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. A dog scratched at the door of a neighbor's hut and was let in without fanfare. It was not a place of miracles, but a place where the small things happened exactly when they should. And that was its magic. Tolan took a long sip and let it sit in his mouth before swallowing, not because it tasted good, but because it tasted known. He didn't say much that morning. He didn't need to. Words had long since become unnecessary between him and the life he had built. Everything spoke on its own now, the trees in their leaning silence, the path worn flat by years of returning, the folded cloth that still hung near the door, though it no longer marked anything urgent. It was enough, he thought. It had all been enough. There had been hunger, and loss, and winters that took too much, but there had also been laughter that arrived without permission, and bread that rose higher than it had any right to, and the unremarkable miracle of waking beside someone who still remembered the child he'd once been. He looked down at his hands, calloused and lined, and turned them slowly, as if reading a story written only for him. Every cut, every thickened knuckle, every half-moon scar, he knew where they'd come from. More than that, he knew why they had stayed. Behind him, Merrill hummed something without melody, a kind of open sound that filled the air the way light filled the corners of the hut. He closed his eyes, leaned back, and let it carry him, not away, but further in. The days continued, soft as worn linen. Spring ripened into early summer without ceremony. Only the quiet turning of shadows and the thickening hum of bees. The fields no longer needed convincing. They responded readily now, like a body that trusts the hands tending it. Tolan worked less, not from weakness, but from a sense that the work no longer needed him in the same way. Others had taken up the tools with steady fingers and respectful silence, and he watched them sometimes with something more tender than pride, a knowing, deep, wordless, knowing that what he had held would continue being held, even when he no longer could. The rhythms had taken root deeper than his reach. That was the goal all along. He realized not to be remembered with grandeur, but to be absorbed into the hum of what lasted, to become part of the scaffolding, unnoticed but essential. One evening, when the sky turned the color of cooled ash and the air was thick with the scent of cut grass and riverstone, Tolan sat by the door, with the last light catching in the grooves beside his mouth. Merrill sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched without needing to. She was peeling something, an apple, maybe, or a turnip, her blade glinting now and then, as if catching secrets. He looked out at the path that curved just enough to suggest arrival, and for a long moment, he simply breathed. In, out, in again. The world had not changed much, but it had grown wider somehow. In the quiet, in the folds, in the small acts that had traveled farther than he ever could. A cloth, folded with intention. A breath, held and released. A life, not loud, not large, but complete, in the way a single thread is complete, when it disappears into the pattern it helped hold together. And when darkness finally came, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like being wrapped in something familiar, something worn, something earned.